Welcome to Finding Home Healing. I'm your host, Sadie. I believe you were born with a light that guides you to your higher self and most passionate life. But for many of us, it's been extinguished or lost. My mission is to help you find your way back home to that light so that you can love deeper, live in your power, and truly thrive. For those lost or lonely souls, welcome home. Welcome to this episode of Finding Home Healing. The episode today is really intended for those open-minded folks who are okay going into some of the corners of philosophy and theology and ask themselves and wonder about bigger questions like, why does evil exist? And why do bad things happen to good people? And if there is a God and God is good, then how does one accept and justify suffering? What is evil and how do I avoid it? I'm really speaking to those who wonder about these types of things and how our world works, people who may have a hard time understanding or agreeing with or feeling at peace with good and evil, or quote unquote bad things happening to them or to loved ones, or potentially things that have happened in their past that they haven't been able to move on from and really make sense of and not justify, but to understand so that they can let it go. People who have a black and white type of mentality of good or bad. It's either good or it's bad. There's no other option. This episode will probably surprise you and open your mind to looking at and thinking about dark and light, good and bad, and evil differently. I'm really excited to dive in. Also, I am the caveat queen, so I just want to make sure that this whole conversation I caveat with the fact that I am in no way invalidating any one person's belief system or a belief system at large, anyone's opinions, perspectives, beliefs. I will be sharing some of my own opinions, perspectives, and beliefs and conclusions, really ultimately for the purpose of helping those who feel lost or those who are needing the help and the guidance and the wherewithal to understand some of these things that would really, really help them. Again, like I said, to either let go of things that they've been holding on to for a long time or really justify and understand different experiences that they've had. So if you're one of those people and this helps you, that's amazing. That's really my goal. And if it doesn't, that's totally okay. You can completely ignore this and never listen to it ever. I'm not offended by that, nor does that bother me. I'm really here to speak to the people that I'm here to help. So regardless, everyone is always welcome. I want to start by saying that, in my opinion and belief, there's a misnomer that good and evil are opposites, that it's one and the other, and those are two forces that are operating in conflict with each other. That's simply not true. The true opposite is actually good and bad. And evil is not bad and bad is not evil. Well, let me rephrase that. Bad and evil are not synonymous. We're going to get a little bit into semantics today and into, definitions of words, just because I think that that's really important when we're talking about these kinds of energies. And to be quite honest, the English language I love it, and it definitely falls short in a lot of ways of expressing different spectrums of energy. So good and bad are opposites. They're part of duality. Evil, though, is its own separate category. It's a whole nother field of things. In some senses, it has an opposite, but in other senses, it kind of doesn't. It's like its own thing, its own world. And it exists in the void outside of duality. Now, you might not really understand what I'm saying here because, what does that even mean? What is the void? What is duality? So let's get really clear on some definitions. When I say the void, what I'm really talking about is the empty space that was created during the first separation. So I have a whole podcast about my personal belief about the creation of everything and how it all came into being. But to be brief here for this conversation, if we look at it theologically and philosophically, In almost every creation story that exists, whether it's a mythical story, whether it's a story from the Bible, whether it's from, peoples from the Aboriginals or the ancient Hawaiians, whoever and whatever, there is a creation story that boiled down, it starts with one thing and it turns into two things. And then eventually there's three, right? Because if there was the original one thing that existed and it split into two things, then there's now those two things and the original thing from which was split from. Okay, so think about it like there being a triangle. At the top of the triangle is, let's call it unity or all or everything. And that split into two things, creating what we call duality or dichotomy. And those two things are opposites. They're at the bottom of the triangle. Okay, this would be what you'd think of as like good and bad, light and dark, left and right, sun and moon, night and day, that type of thing. They are like the complete opposite of each other. You have to have that which is not in order to have that which is. If you do not have something's opposite, you do not have that first thing, right? This is very philosophical, but it's understood in philosophy, this concept that in order for something to be, it also has to not be. Something has to be in existence in order for it to not exist, and something has to be able to not exist in order to exist, except for the all. The all, the one, is the only exception to this rule because it was the original all. It was the original everything, and it's what split into two things. Okay, and this is apparent even in the Genesis Bible story of Adam and Eve, right? God was the all, and he created all these things on the planet, and he made Adam and eventually Eve, and those were what you would call like the two opposites. So there was the all, which was God. He made the two opposites, Adam and Eve, male, female. And in all of creation, everything has to have an opposite. In order for anything to exist, it also has to have that which it is not. This is going to get into other topics like when we start talking about shadow and psychology and ego, right? The ego is that which you think that you are, and the shadow is that which you think you are not. And that's a whole nother podcast topic. So I'm going to stay focused here. But that's what I mean by the void. When that separation started, there was a void in between those two separate items or objects or energies, right? You can also even think of it like, I've heard some creation stories where the first all separated into magnetism and electricity. Magnetism represented the feminine and electricity represented the masculine. And it was the magnetism and the electricity that when those two things like reacted off of each other, then it made more creation. Everything is acting upon each other to make another thing. Another example of this is very simply how you make a baby. You need the egg and you need the sperm, and that creates an embryo. And that embryo then grows into another baby. So everything is this constant cycle of being the one into two, and then joining and becoming a one again, and then into two, and then joining, becoming a one again, into two. It's this like constant pattern of how things come into being. So like the mother-father would represent the two bottoms of the triangle, right? The mother came from the union of their mother, and that mother turned into the one thing. But then the father also came from the union of their mother-father, turned into the one thing, and now they're the two opposites that come together, and they form a one thing called an embryo that turns into a child, and that child is the one thing. And then that child will find the other opposite of itself in order to procreate, and it will turn into another one thing. Okay, so we get the picture. This is duality, and this is how, in my perspective, all of creation is set up from a very functional perspective. And it's the duality, like I said, that makes creation possible. So the void, again, is the space in between those two opposites. So if you're going back to our geometric analogy, if the one side is on the left, the other side is on the right of the bottom of the triangle, then the line or the space in between those two things is what we'd call the void. What I said earlier, evil exists in the void. It is outside of duality. The misnomer here that so many people are doing and that a lot of religious teachings are giving us is that evil is on the point where one of the opposites is. So like, for instance, at the bottom of a triangle, good would be on the left and evil would be on the right of the base of the triangle. That's not true. Evil actually exists in the middle, and bad, if you will, is like the opposite of good. So in the phase of separation, there was a void that was created in between those two energies. And you can think of it like when the earth is fractured at a tectonic plate, like the Grand Canyon, for instance. That's not necessarily a tectonic plate, but when there's two things and they separate, I know that those of you who aren't watching this as a video, this is going to be a little bit harder for you to understand, but I have my two hands and they're combined together here with my pointer fingers touching each other on the sides. Those two things are together. When those two things separate, there's a space. There's an emptiness. What fills that space? What is that space made out of? That's a lot of the questions that like physics is answering right now. They're finding things like black holes, and they're doing this through means of string theory and all of these crazy parts of physics. But we're trying to figure out like, okay, when two things are separate, what's in that hole? What's in the void? What's in the canyon? And in my opinion and experience and the way I understand things, evil is existing in that void, that hole, like what you would consider like a black hole or the canyon, or the space between the two things. That's where evil's living. Okay, so duality, like I said, these two things, the void is the empty space that was created during the first separation, and that's how evil is getting into our world. It's like coming in through the cracks, if you will. And this is important to understand because it is within our power and it is our right to have authority over evil forces. And I have actually been told by people that I either work with or in my personal life that we get into this topic of conversation. I humbly accept their compliments that they share with me, like, wow, Sadie, you have such an interesting way of making this like really scary and dark thing very approachable and very logical and make a lot more sense and it not be so scary or feel so powerful. And that's really what I intend to help you understand through this conversation, is that when we understand evil in this way, it's actually something that we have so much more authority over and that we are not susceptible to as much, and that we do not have to entertain and we do not have to perpetuate. So if you think about evil as this force that if you don't own the fact that you have authority over it, it can kind of wreak havoc on your reality, on your life, on people that you love. That's a really unfortunate outcome. And I don't want that outcome for any of you. I didn't want it for myself for the longest time, but it took me forever to figure this out. But now that I have, it all clicks and it makes so much sense for me. That's what I'm really hoping for you. Okay, so when we ask the question, like, why do bad things happen to good people? It's really due to this evil force. It's not necessarily because good people deserve evil. It's not necessarily because they are deserving of punishment or because they did something wrong or because they are not in good standing with maybe whoever they think is in control of judging them or giving them their fate. In my opinion, that is not the case. It is really due to the fact that we haven't owned our power and authority over evil. We have not been able to see it as a force that we can interact with in a way that we acknowledge that it exists. We acknowledge that it's here, unfortunately, because it didn't always used to be here. That force, again, came into the void. But we can acknowledge it as something that is an influence on our lives and on our persons and on our choices, but that we can have authority over. Okay? So bad things happening to good people. It is not because God is smiting them. This is all, again, my opinion. It is not because they deserve it in some way. And even there's some belief systems that it's like, well, it's their karma. Like they either built up a bunch of past lives in the past where they were bad or they did these things and now they deserve the wrath of God. No, I don't believe that. If they're experiencing what they call the wrath of God, then that, in my opinion, would be the influence of this evil force that's living in the void. And again, in my opinion, if they were to have more authority over that evil force, they would be able to close that gap within themselves. This is what is really important about understanding this whole gap and the void situation, because as a external manifestation of separation, we internally have a separation inside of us. When we come to this planet, when we're born into human form, we also have separation inside of us. Not as much when we're like just born, like newborns and toddlers, but that crack, think of it like a fault line inside of us, it's there. And as our lives progress and we experience hurt, we experience fear, we experience anger, we experience shame or embarrassment, guilt, sadness, all of those emotions, think of it like it rumbles the plates. If our energy was analogous to the Earth's tectonic plate system, those negative emotions are like rumbling those tectonic plates and making those quote unquote fault lines very weak, and it allows for those quote unquote plates to separate and to have fragments or to have voids, right? So then the plates start moving away from each other. These parts of us that exist inside of us are separating, which I call fragments. And that leaves the void. That leaves this openness for evil to come live inside of us. It allows evil to have a home inside of us, which we didn't do purposefully. We didn't actually invite it in. We didn't want it to happen. Usually, most of the time, our loved ones don't want that to be the case. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to give them anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, shame, embarrassment, any of those negative emotions that kind of move those tectonic plates inside of us that then cause this void and separation. But we inevitably do, because we're infallible, we're imperfect, we're human, and that's just what happens. So if we can understand this whole process and how this happens, that as children, our plates are really tight, just like how kind of if you understand like newborns and how their brains work, like their brains are still forming all of the bones in their skull. That's why they're so fragile, because all of the bones and they're all still working to fit into place. That's kind of like how these energetic tectonic plates in our bodies, if you will, are happening. They're still moving around. They're finding their place to settle in. And again, any of those like more negatively oriented experiences, the more that those happen and the more those emotions get stuck, then the more separation there is, the bigger the gap, which means the more evil can live and exist in that human body or in that consciousness in your energy field. Okay, so even if you're a good person, you could still have evil living and existing inside your void. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong or that you've purposefully been hosting an evil force. It is not any fault of your own, but it is happening. And that's what's so important to acknowledge and recognize, is like every single person, I don't care who you are, has the capacity for evil. Every single person has the capacity for evil. That is just the way that it is. We are good people when we choose not to act on those evil forces, and when we close our gaps, when we integrate our tectonic plates inside of us, when we integrate our parts, when we bring parts of us together and we're in more unity and we're in more cohesion, that is what would be considered like unconditional love. And that is what prevents evil from existing. So it is literally my MO in my personal life and to help other people. It is that. It is to bring parts of yourselves together into unity and into cohesion so that evil doesn't have anywhere to live, exist, or breathe. It is really shutting evil out and saying, no, you can't exist here. This is not a home for you. I am not a host for you. All of my spaces are taken up by my proper parts being integrated, and I have all of these parts of myself that I need and that I'm happy with, and evil, no, I say no to you. Okay? That does not mean that you're not susceptible to duality. Even if a person fully integrated all their parts, eliminated all of their voids, and there were no spaces where evil could live inside of them, they would still be susceptible to duality, because we are all susceptible to duality. That doesn't go away. That is, again, wrapping back around to what I just said, that is how creation works. So it would be like saying, I want to be a human and only exist in sunlight and never be in the dark. That's just not possible. You actually need darkness. You have to have darkness in order for your brain to settle down, in order for you to sleep, in order for your brain to release melatonin, which allows you to become tired and rest. And if you don't ever sleep or rest, then your body will burn out and you'll die. Okay, so the duality is necessary. We need the sunlight and we need the darkness. We need the sun and the moon. We need hot water and we need cold water for different purposes. They serve different purposes. They're actually good for us. We have a tendency in our perspective of the world and how we're taught to think that some things are bad and some things are good. That's what I was mentioning before. Like, there are some of us, which I was one of them, full on, like hardcore, where I had this perspective that things were either good or bad. There was no in between. There was no neutral. And I actually worked with a friend who wasn't technically a client, but he was a friend who I did stuff like I would do with a client, where he was really trapped in this idea of good or bad. And what I did to help him understand that your perceived bad things can have good parts to them, and the perceived good things can have bad parts to them, really helped him understand this concept that it's like, oh, there is actually inherent neutrality in duality, because not all good things are just all good and not all bad things are all bad, right? There's a combo. The example I gave for this was, I had him imagine that he zoomed out of the planet Earth and he was floating in space and he could see the Earth. And I had him pick a spot on the Earth that was the most relaxing, amazing spot that he could imagine, on a beach with the sun shining and the water, being really delectable and delicious to go into. And I had him imagine that. And he was like, wow, this is good. This is so good. This is what I would call good, right? And then I had him imagine that he flew across the globe and he was in a thunderstorm. And it was cold, it was lightning and thundering, it was loud, it was uncomfortable, it was horrible, and that was bad, right? So he had these two associations to what was good and what was bad. Then I had him float back to the beach scene, and I had the sun get so hot and so scorching and sweltering that it was burning him. And he had no reprieve. Like, he couldn't find any shade anywhere, because in his scene, it was the sun and the water and the beach, and that was considered good to him. But now the sun was beating down so hard that he was burning and he was in a lot of pain. And that turned into bad. Then I had him float back around to the thunderstorm, and he started, in this visualization, feeling the water on his skin, and he was not under the scorching sun, and he was feeling this relief and this coolness and the relief of the water on his skin and the shade of the clouds. And he was like, oh, wow, this is good. So what he initially thought was good and bad, there were bad parts to it, or bad possibilities that could happen, and there were good parts to it and good possibilities that could happen. So duality and what's good and bad is very subjective, and it's not always set in stone. And I want us to use that to our advantage, because when something's not set in stone, that means that there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of things we can do with it. If something that you label as being bad has happened to you or to somebody that you know, even though that thing itself could be bad, does not mean that it has to be taken as a bad thing in its meaning. And what I mean by that is, you can always extract something positive from something bad or evil. I'll give you a personal example. I went through a horrible illness, and It rocked my whole world. I couldn't move. I couldn't talk. I couldn't even take myself to the bathroom. I thought that my whole life as I knew it was over, that I was going to be kind of a vegetable for the rest of my life. And my family had no idea what was wrong with me. None of the doctors, none of the ER people, none of the specialists, the neurologists, none of them could figure out what was wrong with me. I kept going into episodes of paralysis that were like conscious comas. I have a whole nother podcast about this, but I thought that like my life was over. And in my world, that's the most evil thing that I could ever experience. That's the worst bad thing that I could ever experience. And granted, chronic and complex illness is not an inherently good thing per se. Like, I think we could all agree on that. But what I got out of it and what it gave me and how I was able to use it to my advantage for good was possible. And that's what I did. I allowed that experience to empower me instead of victimize me. I allowed that experience to strengthen me instead of degrade me. I allowed that experience to teach me and show me how powerful my mind really is and how powerful healing really is, and that I don't have to be susceptible to things in my environment. And I learned so much about my genetics and the way my body is built and things that I would like to give it more of and things I would like to avoid. And I got so much more information. I was so much more empowered from it. Did I feel this way during the illness? Not so much. I really wanted to die. I didn't want to exist anymore. I was very depressed. I hated everything and never thought I could be the same again. But I continuously kept reminding myself, and other people that were loved ones of mine also kept reminding me that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is a reason for this. There is something positive and good you can extract from this. And that's the way to help not only avoid evil, but to make sense of how and why bad things are happening to us. Because evil is its own influence, right? That we have the power to have authority over and to not let it into our lives by that integration process and doing that throughout time. And that the bad things that maybe aren't considered evil, but that are bad, all have a light side to them. They all have a good side to them. So your job and your goal in all of life is to be able to start seeing that good side. It's such a cliche of like the glass is half full, not half empty, right? Like that inherently is neutral, that the glass is filled up to a certain level. And you have the choice to either see it, the glass is half full, or the glass is half empty. Even if you do see it half empty, there's positive things to that. Like, I'm so glad this is half empty because I don't have enough room in my stomach to drink a whole glass. Or I'm so glad this is half empty because I don't need to have a whole glass. Maybe it's wine or something. I don't know. But there's always, always, always something that you can extract from everything, whether you label it as good, bad, or evil. There's always something positive that you can extract from it. And when you do, it actually turns that thing into something positive. Because you could go out into the world and have all of these horrible negative things go on, but the minute that you become the one that changes it and spins it into something positive, then you've just changed the trajectory of that thing for every single other person. Like, I'll give you an example. When I work with clients, like one specifically I was working with last week, and we were doing a lot of release work, and she was having a lot of anger and annoyance and sadness with relation to feeling like loneliness and abandonment and a lot of embarrassment and shame. And not only does that have to do with these fragments that I'm talking about that we need to integrate, that once we do, that void that evil can live in disappears, but we are releasing these negative emotions. And the process through which we're doing that is by extracting a learning from the experience, the root cause of that emotion. So when she was feeling embarrassed, we floated back to a time in her past where that embarrassment started, where the root of that existed, and she learned something positive from that experience. And what did that do? It released the emotion. She didn't feel the embarrassment anymore because she took something positive from it. She extracted the learning which is really the ultimate purpose and goal of everything that we experience, in my opinion, that we extract the learning from it, we evolve and we grow, we become more of who we are, we become a closer manifestation to our highest self. And so she took that learning, she took it with her, and the emotion disappeared. And that's really what happens when you can extract something positive from something negative. It either neutralizes it or it turns it positive. It's so cool. Like, you have so much more power than you think that you do or that you've been told. And I really, really want this message to be something that you own as like, whoa, I have so much power in every single moment. If something bad or negative is happening to me or someone else, there is a silver lining. There is something that could come out of this that's good. I was talking about this to one of my clients. This was maybe months ago, and it really stands out to me as an example because he was having a difficult time understanding this concept, and because he couldn't let go of the fact that like the thing itself is still inherently bad or evil. And I gave him the example of like, if me and my partner were sleeping in bed and some person broke into the house, came in, shot my partner, murdered him in an instant, and then left, didn't even take anything from the house, just came in and committed like the most evil and sinister crime that I could maybe even possibly imagine, and how horrible and how evil and bad and wrong that is, and how distraught I would be, and just how horrible that is. There is no way, shape, or form to make that thing itself good or right or loving. The fact that that person came and committed that crime, there is really no way to make that thing itself good. So that's what I want to be clear about. However, I could take that experience and I could, commit suicide. I could go out and hurt somebody else. I could become so depressed that I withdraw from all my relationships and all of my loved ones, and I live a life that is meek and bleak and depressing and sad. I could do all sorts of things. Like, there's an infinite amount of possibilities that could happen and how I respond to that experience. There's also a positive side that I could respond. I could take that experience and I could become an advocate for house protection. Like, I could go door to door and sell cameras for security purposes. I could do any number of things that would be a positive extraction from that experience that would empower me and would empower other people. And maybe I, become an advocate for mental health, that perhaps this person was so mentally ill that they were, taken over by these evil forces and didn't know it. Maybe I do work kind of like I'm doing now, where I, amplify my voice and be able to talk about how evil can really influence and impact certain people's behaviors and their susceptibility to it, and be able to stop that from happening. And maybe I save somebody else from that person doing it to them. There's all these different possibilities. And if you think about it, it's like, you can be a domino effect for one or the other direction. Everything is starting with you. You are the one that decides, do I go down this path of victimhood and of like lack and of all these like horrible bad things, or do I choose to see them for good? There's a quote in the Bible, I believe it's Romans 8:28, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't have it memorized, but the concept is that God can cause all things to work together for good. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is talked about by a lot of the thought leaders, a lot of the mystic leaders, even people that channel. They and there's this consensus around, regardless of what's happening, there's always something positive you can extract from it. So when we're talking about evil and bad things, there might be things that are inherently evil or bad that are happening, but you do not have to let it impact you. You can choose to respond differently. You can choose to allow that experience to integrate into you differently, just like my illness. I don't think of myself as a victimized person who has chronic and complex illness. I think of myself as a person who has overcome chronic and complex illness even though I still have symptoms of it, I don't think about that. I think about the version of me that exists, that is healthy and happy and fully congruent and complete with a healthy body. And I have overcome chronic and complex illness, and I am an empowered person who now gets to talk about it and who gets to help other people have that same empowered mindset, because that's really the difference here. Okay, so bad things that happen to good people, that from this conversation now, you might even think that that's kind of a moot point, because bad things, okay, that's part of duality. We're all susceptible to bad things, but is it really bad if we're taking something positive from it? And just because you're a good person doesn't mean that you're not susceptible to the duality of life. Just because you're a good person doesn't mean that you're not exposed to the sun and the moon and that you need light and you need dark. That doesn't have anything to do with it. I do believe that it's important to be what we would call and consider a good person, because when we do that, we have positive impacts, not only neurologically, chemically, hormonally, externally, environmentally. Like, that is what human nature and humankind is constantly trying to go towards. We're always trying to go up. If you think about it, like, we always want to be on a hill. We want to be on the top spot. We want to be number one. Like, being up high. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. We want to be up high. We are constantly wanting to go up and progress and evolve. So those things are inherently important to us as people. And in order to do that, we have to, for lack of a better term, combat these more negative influences. Okay. And I want to also make sure that we're clear here that evil and bad are different. Yes, we could say that evil is bad, but they are not the same thing. It is not good versus evil. It is good and bad as part of duality. Evil exists in the void as this like other entity option that's kind of out there. And this is, as I understand it now, I might end up having some download or some epiphany and be able to explain it in a better way. But for now, this is my understanding of the format of it and how it's laid out. And so my last thing that I want to answer here is, if there is a God and God is good, how does one accept and justify suffering? I hope by now that it's clear that evil is not necessarily the opposite of God. I know that's how we've been taught in religious doctrines, in Christianity, that it's God and the devil, and those are the two combating forces. I don't see it that way. I have lots of other podcasts about topics around spirituality and religion, but I want to set this conversation today and have you leaving with really having this open mind thought around the fact that God and the devil are not these opposing forces. What I call evil, again, is living in the void, and we can prevent evil from affecting us by bringing and integrating our parts, like I said, when we're little kids, and our childhood trauma, our inner child trauma, bringing all those parts together so that we are eliminating the space for evil to exist, and that we are in alignment with what fills us up. What is our highest and best self? What excites us? What is our passion? Not that we're aiming to please our God, but that we are really living in a way that is in alignment with who we know ourselves to be, or who we are in our highest version of ourselves. A lot of people that have religious trauma, at least in the form that I've had it, we have a lot of conditioning around good or bad. And that's something that I brought up in the beginning of this podcast also, that there's a lot of conditioning around, well, this is good and this is bad, and I'm right or I'm wrong. And some people take that really far, and some people really hold on to like, I'm right and this is the way of things and this is the way, and if anyone disagrees with me, then I will fight them because I am right. Totally respect and appreciate that. I'm not the same. I have tended more toward the I'm wrong side of the spectrum, where I have constantly felt like, oh my God, like I'm wrong, I'm so sorry, you're right, and just defaulting to like, I did it wrong, or I am wrong, or I can't do it right, that type of thing. And that is really damaging. Both of those sides are really out of balance. They're not here neutrally in the middle. And the benefit of being in the middle is that you can be more harmonious with anything that comes at you. Like if you notice when I have my podcasts and when I'm speaking to you, I totally appreciate and respect every person and every belief and every opinion to the best of my ability. I am not out here preaching like this is the way and this is what's right. And if you don't believe this, then you're going to be punished or you'll have all these consequences. But I'm also confident enough to be like, this is the way that I think that it is. I don't think that I'm wrong. And if you point out ways that maybe you think I'm wrong, I might consider it and I'll look into it and like really feel into it. But I'm more in the middle now than ever before. And that's what I hope is an outcome for you if you understand these concepts and look at it from this perspective where you don't have to be in either camp. You can be in neutral. That's the third option. I do have a podcast around the third option and neutrality. So you can tune into that one if this conversation is really exciting and fascinating for you. But this entire like concept of philosophy and theology and evil and duality and good and bad is one of my biggest passions, not only because it's helped me so much understand myself in the sense that like sometimes I'm quote unquote bad and that's still okay. I'm not a bad person. I'm not an evil person. I was told when I was a kid that I was evil, that I was the devil, that I was going to hell, that everything that my natural beingness was, like how I could see and talk to people that had crossed over or passed away, and how I was sensitive to energy, and I believed in psychics when I was little, and I was reading books about conversations with God and like angels and all of that, and I got feedback over and over again that like I'm this bad person, and it was so confusing to me. I'm like, how does being the way that I am make me a bad person? And I know a lot of people will feel that way in certain movements that we've had in society, maybe around like their sexual orientation or whatever it is. It's like there's been so much shame around who you are as a person. And regardless of if I or anyone else agrees with any of it or not, there's a need inherently for each one of us to fully love and accept ourselves and integrate those parts of ourselves so that we get to be more of who we really and truly are. That's the end goal. At the end of the day, that's why we're all here. That's why this conversation is happening. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm here, is because when we are integrated and we are accepting of quote unquote bad things and we're able to extract positive things from them, then we become more of who we really are. And that's what we all crave, honestly. Like if we're sick and tired of our job or we're not happy in our relationship, it's because we're not being who we are. We are not connected to and being ourselves. And we all crave that authenticity. We all crave being able to just say what we want to say and not feel judged, to feel accepted and heard and validated and loved, and to not have all of this conflict and commotion. Like, sure, we need novelty, and yes, we do need conflict because that's the opposite of peace. And I've told you through this whole episode that we need both in order for creation to exist. So that's fine, but let's just like accept that they both exist. It's the yin and the yang. Like sometimes we'll have peace and sometimes we'll have conflict. Sometimes we'll have light and sometimes we'll have dark. That's okay. Okay, so I know, wow, I'm going off on so many tangents here. I'm just feeling really passionate. I hope that you can feel that. And, this topic, I hope has been really supportive for you and really fun for you to explore with me. I am so excited to get to explore more about this topic with other people throughout interviews, throughout the time of this podcast. But I'm really hoping that I've answered some of your questions and that perhaps you are seeing things through a new lens, through a different light, that you understand more why bad things can happen to good people, and that that's not necessarily a bad or wrong thing, that there's always something positive that you can extract from different things, and that you don't have to label bad as evil. Evil is its own thing. It exists in the void outside of duality. And you can really avoid evil by working on integrating your parts, bringing those parts of you back together. You can do this through therapy. You can do this through emotional healing work, energetic healing work. You can do it with yourself. You can do it supervised. You can do it with a coach like me, like one-on-one sessions. That's how I do it with people. You can do it through meditation. There's so many different avenues, but that's really the work here, is integrating those parts and eliminating those voids inside of you where evil is existing. That's really how you avoid it the best. And then you preserve yourself from it by extracting the positive things from everything that's happening in your duality life. My hope for you is that you can go live your day and your life now recognizing things differently and looking at things with a bit of a different perspective, where maybe what you used to think was so bad and wrong, you start seeing maybe some good things that could come of it, or some good parts of it that are already existing. And maybe if you are susceptible to more evil forces, that you are inspired and motivated now to go do some work to heal those fragments and heal those parts, do some inner child healing, bring parts of you back together into unity, go get them back from people that maybe hurt you or that crushed you or betrayed you. Like, those types of experiences are really what allow those cracks to come into us. So this has been really fun. I'm very excited that we got to talk about this today. I'm super excited to go into even more detail eventually in future episodes. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that you've had a wonderful, wonderful time listening to me rant about these fun, crazy, interesting topics. We'll see you in the next episode.